This week we're going to start talking a little bit more about working with target populations or identifying the vulnerable groups of people that we often work with in nonprofits. And one of the things when either creating an organization or furthering the mission and work of an organization that we want to keep in mind is that we want to always make sure that the well-being of the people that we serve is at the forefront of the population that we work with. So what are some of the common characteristics of people who are considered quote-unquote at risk? Usually there's some type of struggle or oppression possible, maybe a disadvantage, and these are some of the conditions that we often recognize or identify as being at risk. So for example, lacks resources or autonomy. A really good example for this is people who maybe have a dire medical condition, and when we think about the state budget right now, or the budget that we don't have, there is a lot of people who are going without care because there's no funding behind it, and so those people would definitely be considered at risk. Stigmatized by society, so folks that often face discrimination for whatever shape or form that comes in. Weakened positions, definitely children, not necessarily because of any difficulty, but because they're considered not able to advocate for themselves, which also qualifies for the next one. But also the elderly population, people with disabilities, etc. People who can't advocate for themselves. So if you've worked with kids, you know that there's all kinds of paperwork required for working with kids. But that can also be tricky because technically a minor is 16, 17 years old. And in a lot of circumstances, children of that age probably can advocate for themselves in a decent manner. Illegal activities, so people who potentially leverage could be used against them due to their illegal activity. And then also considering people maybe who are involved in studies at your agency it could be damaging to the families as well. Or not necessarily even research participants, but because people are receiving services, the stigma that's associated could also be something that we need to consider for friends and family. So when we're thinking about the differences that we face in our profession, they are vast. And really we encounter all kinds of stereotypes, assumptions, expectations that sort of influence the way we work with clients and people in our community. And where we need to commit in our profession is really to continue learning about groups and populations and often work to break down these stereotypes or barriers for people. So when we're thinking about our communities, we have to think about what the differences are and also what the assumptions are about these populations. So when you guys are considering your final project and what your nonprofit is, you want to consider all of these different situations about, who is your demographic population that you are looking to assess. So some of these, obviously, we're very familiar with: race, class, gender, but also thinking about things like tradition. We live in a country where Christianity is the primary religious background, and so for some folks, thinking about different types of worship, holidays, family gatherings, community events, those types of things. Religion obviously falls into that one. Levels of acculturation is another one that would be really prominent. So thinking about the process with which a group or individual changes as they continue to come into contact with a mainstream culture. So is it a community that's fairly, are they a refugee population and they're still learning, etc. So considering all of these different things as well. You also want to consider, for example, geographic location. So are you serving college students at NEIU? Because we have, the main campus, the UC-LC campus, the Southside campus, and the El Centro campus. So that's a very large geographic location. So considering all of those different pieces to the puzzle. So our job is really to become more accustomed to diversity, whether that is through cultural competency or cultural humility. So competency is really a learned expertise about a culture where you learn as much as you can to sort of become an expert. And cultural humility, on the other hand, is though you can learn, the idea that you could ever be an expert is not really a possibility because you're not in that person's position or that community's position. So there's this level of self-reflection and learning so that you kind of are always continuing to maybe take guidance from the community or take pause to understand that you may not be the best person to speak on behalf of the community, regardless of how well you know that population. So when we're developing cultural competency, which I know you guys have talked about in a lot of your classes, one of the things you want to think about with your population, and when you're thinking about this final project, what do you need to learn more about for your population, and what do you need to identify that are important as their experiences? So some of the ways you can do that is reviewing the literature available. So if you are looking at gang violence in Chicago, there's lots of literature available, lots of statistics, but not necessarily a lot from the perspective of maybe the communities or even the people participating in gang culture. So how would you, potentially go about learning about those different types of things? You want to talk with maybe community leaders, and that could be anything from church leaders to, politicians, educators, etc. You could do focus groups, try to recruit people thinking about that. You also want to think about things like historical background, communication styles, dress codes. For those of you that work in schools, I think if there's gang presence, sometimes different colors represent different types of things, so you want to think about that stuff. And we also want to think about our ethnocentrism. So really this belief in the superiority of our own culture. And it's not necessarily a blatant thing. It's maybe just communicated verbally or non-verbally. And that can really impact the way that, we provide services. So it's sort of this idea of recognizing privilege or on maybe privilege that we've gained or unearned privilege. So it might be education that we've all gained, or it simply might be skin color or gender, etc. But these are things we want to think about when we're working with different populations. And for example, I had a student who was interning at a site who was providing a lot of case management and helping people who had been unemployed for a while. And there was a lot of assumption about this population for this person. There was the assumption that this person was lazy, unmotivated, sort of milking the system. And it turns out that this person had an MBA and had been working construction jobs on and off, but really had become ill. And that was sort of what led to sort of this person's downfall. And so it was really a big learning opportunity to recognize that her belief, that she hadn't even realized that she sort of grew up with this idea about what it meant to be unemployable. You also want to consider how your culture has maybe impacted another culture's way of life, and thinking about sort of all of the other things that can interfere. So maybe attitudes, policies, practices. With incapacity, I'm thinking about maybe not having respect for a group or ability to support a group. We see that sometimes. Blindness is what I refer to when it's people recognize people's beliefs, but they don't, they disregard them. So they say, well, that's not relevant, or that's ridiculous. And we hear that sometimes. And it can be an issue in our profession as well when we think about things and what we feel is best for a family or a community. Pre-competence is really recognizing the difference and maybe minimally working to, address it. Competence is sort of welcoming the diversity and learning, creating maybe policy or change. And proficiency is, having astute respect and culture for the population that you're working for. So one of the things about cultural competency and sort of the criticisms about it is that, often we learn from our clients, but competency, the idea of cultural humility encourages us to know about our clients, or cultural competency often encourages us to know about our clients. And so really what we want to do, it's a very subtle difference, but we want to empower our clients and not speak for them. And so thinking about developing programming, we want to make sure that we're representing what our clients' needs are, not what we identify as what we think is the best for our clients. And we see this a lot in government agency programs, restrictions on certain types of benefits, because there's an idea that we want folks to, follow X behavior or not participate in Y behavior. And so it can be a little murky when we're thinking about what we're imposing on a group of people. As social workers, we really value dignity and worth of the individual, but we also want to make sure that by grouping people together and working with them, we don't create a stereotype or perpetuate them as sort of the other, so the outlier or the outcast. And we really also recognize that valuing self-determination can really undervalue focusing solely on, when we're focusing solely on a group. So when you're trying to make change for a large population, sometimes that can undermine self-determination. With humility, as we talked about, it sort of takes a different approach, lifelong learning, and it also requires us to have self-evaluation. How do my beliefs and values influence a group? What are my power dynamics in this relationship? How are my powers being used? And simply by the fact that we're social workers and we're providing a service does give us a certain level of power, right? We're the people that sort of hold the gates to services and referrals, etc. And so there is power that comes with that. And then partnerships, what is your ultimate goal with the community and what perceptions do you want to incorporate or change? We also want to think about how we share our knowledge and consider the ways that we work with populations. So we want to understand how sort of what I call the isms, as you can see listed on the screen, how those isms impact a group or population maybe differently than a general population. In some communities, it is much more taboo to maybe be HIV positive or gay than in other populations. Or in some communities, age is considered to be something to be valued and respected. In other communities, something sort of to be disregarded. So thinking about how in the group you're working with, all of those things come into play as well. And then one of the last things we want to think about is what is going to help you develop the best perspective on your population. So when you're identifying and working with a group, you ultimately want to figure out, what the social issue is. So maybe it's domestic violence, and in a certain community, why you're focusing on that community. And then you want to address how creating a nonprofit or a human service organization would impact them. So identifying the cause and the problem, and then the effect it could have on a community's relationship. And for a lot of these, we obviously want to take a strengths perspective approach, right? We want to empower the people that we're working with, rather than going in and providing a service for the people. And it's a very subtle difference, but when we think about the ways in which we provide services, sometimes it's definitely for a population instead of with a population. And I've left this little This American Life program link on the bottom if you're interested. It's not required for class, but it's about how specifically in Chicago public schools and a lot of schools that have gang-related issues, that if we were actually approaching providing education from a trauma perspective versus sort of this punitive perspective that we currently provide, that we could drastically impact and change the way that we provide services to students. So instead of, for example, expelling a student from school, which ultimately is keeping them out and putting them at greater risk, what are some alternative approaches? So it's an interesting article or thing to listen to if you're in the car, driving or commuting, and you can put it on, and I recommend checking that out.